The racist Gala dinner staff humiliated Will and Jada Smith, but what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and post in the comments where you're watching us from. The glow of the city lights flickered against the sleek black surface of the limousine as it glided through Washington's historic district. Will Smith adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back into the leather seat, gazing out at the ornate buildings that lined the streets. Each structure, from the towering marble columns to the intricate wrought iron gates, radiated wealth, status, and, whether implied or outright, exclusion. Beside him, Jada Pinkett Smith sat upright, her hands resting delicately on the smooth fabric of her evening gown. The dress, a striking emerald green, hugged her frame with elegance, but it wasn't ostentatious. It was a statement, though subtle, of confidence and composure. Her makeup, understated yet flawless, highlighted her sharp cheekbones, while her cropped hair shimmered under the dim interior lighting of the car. "You sure about this?" Will asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a layer of tension he couldn't quite mask. Jada turned her head, meeting his eyes. "Sure about what?" "About walking into a room full of people who think we don't belong there." Her lips curled into a faint smile, but her eyes betrayed something deeper, a flicker of unease. "We faced worse, Will, and we didn't get here by playing it safe." The limousine slowed as they approached the gates of the estate. The mansion loomed ahead, a relic of old money grandeur, its tall windows glowing softly in the early evening. This was no ordinary venue. It was the kind of place where deals were made over glasses of 100-year-old scotch, where alliances were forged with handshakes behind closed doors, and where influence was measured by how many people returned your calls. The invitation to this gala had come unexpectedly, wrapped in the language of charity and goodwill, but Will and Jada both knew better. It wasn't just a fundraiser for education programs or community outreach. It was a display of power, a showcase for the elite to remind everyone who truly ran the world. The car rolled to a stop, and a valet, dressed in a crisp white jacket, opened the door. Will stepped out first, offering his hand to Jada as she followed. Cameras flashed in the distance, capturing moments meant to be curated into glossy magazine spreads and headlines about philanthropy. "Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smith, welcome," the valet said, his voice professional but strained. He glanced quickly at Jada's hair before averting his gaze. Jada straightened, sensing the shift in tone. "Thank you," she replied evenly, her voice steady. Before they could take another step, two uniformed security guards approached. Unlike the smiling attendants who had waved through other guests moments earlier, these guards looked serious, almost grim. "Excuse me, Mr. and Mrs. Smith," one of them said. "We'll need to conduct a quick security check." Jada frowned. "Security check? We've already been cleared." "It's just a precaution," the guard replied, avoiding eye contact. "Please step this way." Will glanced toward the other guests, most of whom were breezing through the main entrance without so much as a second glance from security. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "It's fine," he murmured to Jada. "Let's just get it over with." They followed the guards toward a side entrance, where metal detectors and scanning equipment had been set up. Jada noted the chipped paint on the doorframe and the dim lighting. This was no grand entryway. It felt more like a service corridor, a path designed for deliveries and maintenance staff, not honored guests. Will stepped through the scanner first. The machine beeped, and one of the guards patted him down before clearing him with a curt nod. Jada followed, her dress brushed carefully by gloved hands, as if it were something that might conceal danger. When they were finally cleared, another staff member appeared, gesturing toward a narrow hallway that led into the main ballroom. "This way, please," he said, his tone clipped. Jada hesitated. "Why aren't we going through the main entrance?" The staff member's expression didn't waver. "This is just protocol, ma'am. We appreciate your understanding." She opened her mouth to respond, but caught Will's subtle shake of the head. He didn't want to cause a scene. Not yet. They needed to see how the night unfolded first. The hallway felt colder than it should have, and the sound of their footsteps echoed against the polished floors. At the end of the corridor, double doors opened into the ballroom, revealing glittering chandeliers, gold-trimmed walls, and tables adorned with crisp white linens and towering floral arrangements. Jada took a breath, squaring her shoulders as she stepped inside. Heads turned as they entered, some out of curiosity, others out of something less benign. A woman in a sequined gown whispered to her companion, her eyes flicking toward Jada's short hair. A man in a tuxedo glanced at Will, his expression neutral but assessing, as if trying to place whether Will's fame granted him real importance in a room like this. A staff member approached and led them to their table. Far from the center of the room and the main stage, where the most influential guests were seated. Instead, their table was tucked near the edges, close to the kitchen doors. Jada exchanged a glance with Will. He could see the frustration flicker behind her carefully composed expression. "It's just a seat," he whispered, leaning toward her. Jada forced a smile and nodded, but inside her anger simmered. It wasn't just the seat, it was the message. As the evening progressed, the subtle slights continued. Drinks were delayed, servers passed their table without stopping, and when Jada raised her hand to flag down a waiter, he barely concealed his irritation before taking their order. Will tried to make conversation, but the undercurrent of hostility in the room was impossible to ignore. The laughter at other tables felt louder, the conversations more animated, while their corner of the room remained conspicuously quiet. Jada reached for her glass of water, but her hand trembled slightly. She clenched her fingers around the stem of the glass, steadying herself. "We don't belong here," she murmured under her breath. Will turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Yes, we do." She looked into his eyes and saw the determination that had carried them through countless challenges before. But this time it felt different. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was something deeper, something systemic. And it was only the beginning. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversations filled the opulent ballroom. But for Will and Jada, the atmosphere felt heavier with each passing moment. Their table, pushed to the outskirts of the room, felt like an island, isolated and conspicuously distant from the sparkling epicenter of activity. The placement hadn't been an oversight. It was intentional. Jada's eyes scanned the room. The central tables, adorned with towering floral arrangements and personalized name cards, overflowed with familiar faces, actors, politicians, and CEOs who exchanged warm handshakes and knowing smiles. She noted the clusters of servers attending to those tables, refilling glasses and placing dishes with the precision of performers in a choreographed dance. Their own table, however, was conspicuously bare. No centerpiece, no personalized touches. It looked hastily assembled, as if its purpose was more functional than celebratory, and their waiter had yet to even approach them. Jada leaned toward Will, lowering her voice. "You see this, right?" Will nodded, his eyes fixed on a waiter who hovered near a nearby table but continued to ignore theirs. "Yeah, I see it." Jada exhaled slowly, forcing herself to unclench her jaw. She'd faced situations like this before. The coded messages hidden in casual dismissals, the polite but condescending tone meant to remind her of her place. Still, this was different. This wasn't some exclusive boutique or snooty hotel lobby. This was a room full of people who claimed to be progressive leaders, who gave speeches about diversity and inclusion while treating her and Uil like outsiders who had stumbled into the wrong party. After several more minutes of waiting, Jada raised her hand to signal for service. The waiter, a tall, clean-cut man with slicked-back hair and a crisp white jacket, finally made his way over. He stopped short of their table, offering only a perfunctory nod. "Good evening," he said, his voice flat. "Can I get you something to drink?" Jada arched an eyebrow. "We've been sitting here for 20 minutes. A glass of water would have been nice 10 minutes ago." The waiter's lips tightened. "I'll bring that right over." "No," Will interrupted. "You'll bring us the menu first. Then we'll talk about drinks." The waiter hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Will's tone. "Of course, sir. One moment." As the waiter disappeared, Jada leaned back in her chair, her frustration barely contained. "It's deliberate," she whispered. "I know," Will replied, "but let's not make a scene yet." Jada's gaze flickered across the room again, catching the eyes of another guest, a woman with a diamond necklace and a champagne flute balanced between her fingers. The woman smiled tightly, then turned away, whispering something to the man beside her. Will followed her line of sight. "Don't let them get in your head," he said softly. Before Jada could respond, the waiter returned with menus and, finally, a pair of water glasses. He set them down carelessly, splashing water onto the tablecloth as he did. "Sorry about that," he muttered, but his expression remained impassive. Jada reached for a napkin to blot the spill, but the damp spot lingered like a stain on her mood. She watched the waiter stride away without even glancing back. Moments later, another server appeared at the adjacent table, presenting a tray of hors d'oeuvres with a flourish. The guests there laughed and exchanged pleasantries as the server poured wine and adjusted silverware. It was a stark contrast to the perfunctory service Jada and Will had received. Jada set her menu down. "I can't ignore this." "We're not ignoring it," Will said, his voice low but firm. "We're watching, gathering, timing matters." Jada swallowed the retort that rose to her lips. She knew Will was right. She also knew it took everything in her not to confront the waiter, the guests, and the organizers who had decided that she and Will weren't worthy of equal treatment. The courses began arriving slowly, each dish presented without enthusiasm. At one point, their plates sat empty long after the tables around them had been cleared. Jada caught the waiter's eye and raised her hand, but he turned abruptly, pretending not to notice. "Seriously?" Jada hissed under her breath. Will's hand brushed against hers under the table. "Let it go, for now." But Jada couldn't let it go. She noted the details, the uneven service, the lack of eye contact, the way the staff treated them like an obligation rather than honored guests. And then there were the stares. Subtle but ever present, like the flicker of candlelight. The worst moment came when a passing guest, clearly drunk, stopped at their table. "Didn't think I'd see Hollywood here tonight," the man said with a smirk. "Guess even actors want to play with the big boys sometimes." Uil's eyes narrowed. "We're here to support a cause." Sure, the man replied, clearly uninterested in the answer. His gaze shifted to Jada. "And I have to say, love the bold look. Not everyone can pull off, you know." He gestured vaguely toward her hair, or lack thereof. Jada's chest tightened. She'd prepared herself for whispers, for stares, but this, the thinly veiled mockery, It hit deeper than she'd expected. Will rose slightly, his towering presence enough to make the man step back. "Enjoy your evening," Will said sharply, dismissing him with a glare. As the man shuffled away, Jada forced herself to breathe. She could feel the heat of humiliation rising in her cheeks, but she refused to let it show. "They're pushing us," she said. "Let them," Will replied. "We'll push back harder." The night dragged on. Servers continued to avoid their table, and more guests made offhand comments disguised as compliments. Jada held her composure, but the cracks were forming. By the time dessert was served, late and carelessly plated, Jada's patience had worn thin. She pushed her plate away and turned to Ul. "This isn't just about bad service," she said. "It's a pattern." "I know," Ul replied. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with the same fire Jada felt. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The weight of the evening bore down on Jada like an unwelcome hand pressing against her chest. Around her, the ballroom buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, but at their corner table, a different atmosphere reigned, one of exclusion and isolation. The subtle slights had started the moment they arrived, and with each passing hour they had only grown more pointed. Jada sat stiffly, her fingers resting on the edge of her plate, her appetite long gone. The dessert in front of her was poorly presented, a lopsided slice of cake with crumbs scattered across the plate, a glaring contrast to the pristine arrangements at other tables. She barely noticed the food. Her gaze was fixed on the neighboring table, where waiters moved with practiced grace, refilling wine glasses and presenting desserts with smiles and polished banter. Here, at their table, there was no banter, only silence and resentment disguised as politeness. The waiter assigned to their table, a man in his mid-30s with slicked-back hair and an ever-present smirk, returned, but not to refill their drinks. Instead, he hovered near the table, pretending to check the utensils while clearly eavesdropping on their conversation. "Everything all right?" he asked finally, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. Jada opened her mouth to respond, but Will placed a hand over hers, silencing her before the words spilled out. "We're fine," Will said, his tone measured. "You can go now." The waiter lingered for a moment longer, then walked away without another word. Jada exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous," she said quietly. "They're not even trying to hide it." "They don't think they have to," Ul replied. Jada turned her attention back to the other tables, watching as a group of men in tuxedos laughed loudly at some private joke. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the way they glanced in her direction, the smirks that followed. It was then that she heard the comment. "Hollywood types always think they belong everywhere," one of the men said, loud enough to be overheard. Another man chuckled. "They're just here for the photos. Make it look like they care about something other than their next paycheck." The laughter that followed grated against Jada's nerves, sharp and cutting. She forced herself to stay seated, but her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "They think this is funny," she said, her voice tight. "They think we're funny," Will corrected. Before Jada could respond, one of the men, the one who had spoken first, stood up and approached their table. He was tall, with graying hair and a sharp jawline that might have been handsome if not for the arrogance that radiated from him. "Well, look who decided to join us tonight," he said, his smile thin and insincere. "Big fans, by the way. Loved you in, what was it, Independence Day?" Will's expression didn't change, but Jada saw the flicker of tension in his jaw. "Thanks," Will said flatly. The man turned to Jada, his eyes flickering over her dress before settling on her hair. or lack thereof. "And you," he said, "making a statement, huh? Brave look. Not everyone can pull it off." The words hit harder than Jada expected, not because they were overtly cruel, but because of what lay beneath them. The condescension, the implication that she was out of place, too bold, too different. She straightened her back, meeting his gaze with unflinching resolve. "It's not a statement," she said. "It's just who I am." The man's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Of course," he said. "It's very modern." He turned back to Uhl, as if dismissing Jada entirely. "So, what brings you two here tonight? Decided to try your hand at politics?" Uhl leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "We're here to support causes that matter. Same as you." "Is that right?" the man said, his tone almost mocking. "Well, you'll find this isn't Hollywood. Things work a little differently here." Jada could feel the heat rising in her chest. The man's words weren't just condescending. They were a warning, a reminder that no matter how successful they were, there were still places they weren't welcome. Before she could respond, the waiter returned, setting down a glass of red wine in front of Uhl with a little too much force. The liquid sloshed over the rim, splattering onto the tablecloth. "Sorry about that," the waiter said, but his tone lacked any real apology. Uhl's eyes narrowed. "You should be." The waiter hesitated, then turned and walked away. Jada grabbed a napkin and began blotting at the stain, her hands trembling. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, watching, waiting to see how she would react. "This is deliberate," she said under her breath. "I know," Uhl replied. A burst of laughter erupted from the table next to them, and Jada turned just in time to catch one of the men mimicking her movements, wiping an imaginary stain with exaggerated gestures. The others at the table roared with laughter. Jada froze. Her stomach churned, and for the first time that evening, she felt genuinely exposed. Uhl saw it too. He reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Don't let them get to you," he said. But it was too late. The damage had been done. As the laughter died down, the man who had approached their table earlier leaned toward his companions and said something that made them all erupt again. Jada didn't catch the words, but she didn't have to. She knew exactly what had been said. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay seated, to breathe, to keep her composure. Uhl, however, was already leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the group of men. "They think this is funny," he said, his voice low. "They think we'll just sit here and take it," Jada replied. Uhl nodded. "Not tonight." As the next course was served, late and lukewarm, Jada sat back in her chair, her shoulders squared. She was done waiting for respect, done hoping for decency. The night wasn't over, but neither was the fight. Jada's breath felt shallow as she stared at the stained tablecloth, the crimson splash of wine spreading outward like a wound. Around her, the room continued to buzz with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses, but she no longer heard it. Her mind replayed the last few minutes on an endless loop, the waiter's deliberate carelessness, the mocking gestures from the neighboring table, and the snide comment about her appearance disguised as a compliment. Uhl sat beside her, his shoulders tense and his eyes locked on the men who had spent the evening treating them like a spectacle. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the kind of restrained anger that was one sharp word away from boiling over. For years they had faced situations like this, subtle digs, coded language, and those practiced smiles that barely concealed contempt. They had learned to let most of it roll off their backs, knowing that losing control would only feed the narratives others wanted to spin about them. But tonight felt different. Tonight, it wasn't just about them. It was about what their silence might cost. Jada pressed her napkin against the spill one last time, then let it drop onto the table. "I'm done," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her. Will turned toward her. "Jada, no." She cut him off, her eyes blazing. "I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is normal." She pushed back her chair, the sound slicing through the hum of conversation. Heads turned as she stood, their curious glances quickly shifting into wide-eyed stares when they saw the determination etched into her face. Will rose with her, towering over the table as his gaze swept the room. "We need to talk to the manager," he said, his voice loud enough to cut through the murmurs. The waiter, the same one who had spilled the wine, appeared almost instantly, as though he'd been waiting for the moment they snapped. His smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of feigned concern. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked. "You know damn well there's a problem," Will shot back. "Get the manager." The waiter hesitated, and for the first time that night, Jada saw something flicker behind his eyes: uncertainty. He turned and disappeared into the crowd, and the room's attention shifted entirely to them. Jada felt the weight of the stairs pressing down on her, but she refused to flinch. She met each gaze head-on, daring them to look away first. Minutes passed before a tall man in a tailored suit approached. His smile was polished, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith," he began, extending his hand. "I'm Jonathan Price, the event manager. I'm so sorry to hear there's been an issue." Will didn't take the man's hand. "You're not sorry. If you were, you'd have stopped it before it got to this point." Price's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "I assure you, we take complaints very seriously. Why don't we step outside to discuss this privately?" "No," Jada said firmly. "We'll talk about it right here." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd, and the murmurs grew louder. Price's jaw tightened. "This isn't the time or place." "It's exactly the time and place," Jada interrupted. "Because this isn't just about tonight. It's about the way people like us are treated in rooms like this every single day." She swept her arm toward the guests, her voice growing stronger. "You invited us here to support your cause, but the second we walked through those doors, you made it clear we didn't belong. You seated us in the back, you ignored us, and you let your staff humiliate us without a second thought. Mrs. Smith, I understand you're upset, but—" "No, you don't," Will cut in. "You don't understand what it's like to walk into a room and be treated like a prop, or worse, like a threat, just because of how you look. But you're about to." He pulled his phone from his pocket and began recording. "This is Jonathan Price, the manager of tonight's gala," he said, turning the camera toward the man. "He's the one responsible for the way my wife and I have been treated tonight, and for the way every single person in this room has stood by and let it happen." Price's face paled. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stop recording." Will ignored him, panning the camera across the room. "Look at them," he said, his voice low but steady. "These are the people who claim to care about equality and justice. But when it comes to facing the reality of their own bias, they'd rather sweep it under the rug." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Jada could see some guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared defiantly, their arms crossed and their expressions hard. The men at the neighboring table, the ones who had started it all, stood abruptly, their chairs scraping against the floor. One of them pointed at Will. "You're out of line," he snapped. Will lowered his phone. "No, you are." He stepped forward, his voice rising. "You think your money and connections give you the right to treat people like this? To make my wife the punchline of your jokes? To humiliate her in front of a room full of strangers and then pretend it's all in good fun?" The man opened his mouth to respond, but Will cut him off. "Not tonight." Silence fell over the room, heavy and unrelenting. Jada reached for Will's hand, squeezing it tightly. For the first time that night, she felt steady, not because the tension had lifted, but because she knew they weren't alone. Will turned back to Price. "We're leaving," he said, "but this isn't over." They turned and walked toward the exit, the room parting around them like water. Whispers followed them, but Jada held her head high, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. As they reached the door, Will paused and looked back. "One more thing," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "If any of you think this ends here, you're wrong." With that, they stepped outside, leaving the stunned crowd behind. But even as the cool night air hit their skin, Jada knew this was only the beginning. The night air hit Jada like a slap as the heavy doors of the ballroom closed behind her. The muffled sound of chatter and clinking glasses from inside faded, replaced by the low hum of crickets and the faint rumble of passing cars in the distance. The manicured garden surrounding the mansion glistened under soft, golden lights, but its beauty felt hollow, decorative, like the people inside. Jada's heels clicked sharply against the stone steps as she descended towards the circular driveway where their car had dropped them off earlier. Her shoulders were squared, her chin lifted, but the tightness in her chest refused to ease. Will walked beside her, his fists clenched at his sides. The tension in his jaw was visible even in the dim light, and his strides were longer than usual, measured but heavy, like a man barely restraining himself from breaking into a run or throwing a punch. "They think this is over," Jada said, her voice cutting through the night. She stopped abruptly, spinning to face him. "They think we're just going to walk away and let them win." Will turned to her, his eyes burning with the same fire she felt in her veins. "No, they don't," he said. "They think we'll yell for a minute, post a few tweets, and then move on." He paced in front of her, running a hand over his face. "They think we'll let it die out, just like every other time people like them get called out." Jada shook her head. "Not this time." Before Will could respond, the doors behind them swung open. Jonathan Price, the event manager, stepped out, flanked by 2 security guards. His polished demeanor had cracked, and now his face was tight with irritation barely masked as professionalism. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith," he began, walking toward them, "I need to ask you both to leave the property immediately." "We're already leaving," Will snapped, "and we're not interested in hearing whatever weak excuse you're about to give." Price raised a hand as if to calm him, but the gesture only fanned the flames. "Mr. Smith, this behavior is completely inappropriate. You disrupted the evening, embarrassed our guests, and violated event policies by recording without consent. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to involve the authorities." Jada stepped forward before Will could respond, her voice sharp and cutting. "Are you serious right now? You're calling us disruptive after the way we were treated tonight?" Price held her gaze, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "This is a private event. We reserve the right to maintain order." "Order?" Will barked out a bitter laugh. "Is that what you call it, When your staff spills drinks on my wife and lets guests mock her illness?" One of the guards stepped closer. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice." "Or what?" Will demanded, his voice rising. "You're going to arrest me for standing up for my wife, for refusing to let you treat us like garbage while you sip champagne and pretend to care about charity?" Jada reached for his arm, but he pulled away. "No," he said, "I'm done playing nice." The guard moved closer, placing a hand on Will's shoulder. It was a mistake. Before anyone could react, Will knocked the hand away, his voice booming. "Don't touch me!" Jada's heart jumped as the tension erupted into chaos. The second guard grabbed Will's arm, but Will spun out of his grip, stepping back with his hands raised. "Don't you dare!" he shouted. Price flinched, clearly unprepared for the situation to spiral this quickly. The guards hesitated, uncertain whether to escalate. Jada stepped between them. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice commanding. "Everyone, back off!" The guards froze. Even Price seemed unsure of his next move. Jada turned to Price, her eyes blazing. "You need to think very carefully about what happens next. Because if you don't back down, you're not just kicking out 2 guests, you're making this national news. You're giving everyone a front row seat to exactly how people like us are treated in spaces like this." Price's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at the guards, then back at Jada. "This isn't over," he said finally. "No," Jada replied. "It's not." She grabbed Will's hand and pulled him toward the driveway. The guards stayed where they were, their hands hovering near their radios but not moving to stop them. As they reached the waiting car, Jada's adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the gnawing ache of frustration. Will yanked the door open and sat heavily in the seat, his breathing still uneven. Jada slid in beside him, closing the door behind her as the driver pulled away from the estate. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the tires against the pavement. Will leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and pressing his hands together. "I shouldn't have let it get to me like that," he said finally. Jada reached out her hand, resting gently on his back. "No," she said. "You should have. Someone had to." He turned to look at her, his expression softening. I know." For a moment, they just sat there, the tension slowly unraveling. But even as the adrenaline faded, Jada's mind was already moving ahead. "They think we're done," she said quietly. Will sat up straighter. "But we're not." Jada pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. "We're going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Will nodded, his jaw set. "Let's start with the video." He pulled out his phone, replaying the footage he had captured earlier in the evening. The manager's dismissive tone, the waiter's smirk, and the mocking laughter of the other guests. All of it was there, undeniable and raw. Jada leaned closer, her voice low but steady. "We're going to make them see this for what it is." Will looked at her, his eyes hard with determination. "No more pretending." "No more pretending," Jada echoed. And as the car carried them away from the glittering facade of the mansion, they both knew the night wasn't over. It was only the beginning of something far bigger. The car cut through the quiet streets of Washington, D.C., its headlights carving paths through the darkness. Will sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at his phone's screen as the video replayed again. The grainy footage captured the sneering expressions of the guests, the dismissive smirks of the staff, and the icy, practiced professionalism of Jonathan Price as he tried to silence them. Jada leaned against the car door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her mind churned, replaying every moment of the night, from the first suspicious glances to the mocking laughter and the spilled wine. Her stomach tightened every time she remembered the man's comment about her hair. It wasn't just the words that lingered. It was the way the others had laughed, as if her pain was entertainment, as if her illness was nothing more than a punchline. "They won't get away with this," she said, breaking the silence. Will looked up from his phone. "They won't," he said firmly. Jada sat up straighter. "We can't wait. We need to post this now, before they have a chance to spin it." "Not yet." Jada turned sharply toward him. "Not yet? Well, if we wait too long, they'll bury it. They'll call us liars and blow this off as another overreaction." "They're going to do that anyway," he said, locking eyes with her. "But if we post this right now, it's just us versus them. And you know how that plays out. They'll gaslight, deny, and throw their PR teams at this until no one cares anymore." Jada hated that he was right. As much as it burned, she knew how these fights worked. Without evidence and strategy, the truth could be drowned out by carefully crafted lies. "So, what do we do?" she asked. "We call in reinforcements." Will scrolled through his contacts and selected a name. Dana Matthews, a journalist known for exposing corruption and discrimination in high-profile spaces. Her work had brought down CEOs and senators alike. If anyone could handle this story, it was her. He hit the call button, and after 2 rings, Dana picked up. "Will?" Her voice was sharp, professional. "What's going on? Are you free?" "Not exactly," she said, "but for you? Always. What happened?" "Meet us," he said. "Tonight." Dana didn't hesitate. "Where?" "Home." "On my way." When Will hung up, Jada exhaled and leaned her head back against the seat. "You really think this is the way?" "It's the only way," he said. By the time Dana arrived at their house, the tension in the living room was palpable. Will had poured himself a drink he hadn't touched, while Jada paced back and forth near the windows. Dana entered briskly, a leather bag slung over her shoulder and a notepad already in her hand. She was dressed casually, but there was nothing casual about her demeanor. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before settling on Will and Jada. "Start from the beginning," she said, pulling out her phone to record. For the next hour, Will and Jada recounted every detail: the security check, the seating arrangements, the deliberate neglect by the staff, and the humiliation at the table. Jada's voice broke when she described the mockery about her hair, but Dana didn't interrupt. She listened, her pen flying across the page as she took notes. When the story was finished, Dana sat back and tapped her pen against the notepad. "This isn't just about you," she said finally. "It's bigger. You know that, right?" "Of course we do," Jada snapped. "We've known it our whole lives, but we're not letting it slide this time." Dana nodded. "Good, but you need more than outrage. You need evidence." Will held up his phone. "We've got it." Dana leaned forward as he played the video, her expression darkening as she watched. "This is good," she said, "really good, but it's not enough." "What do you mean, not enough?" Jada asked, her frustration rising again. "They'll say it's out of context," Dana explained. "That it's just one bad waiter or one careless comment. We need proof that this wasn't an isolated incident. Patterns, policies." Jada's eyes lit up. "Lucia." Dana frowned. "Who?" "The housekeeper," Jada said quickly. "She was the only one who treated us like we mattered. And before she left our room, she told me to ask for her if we needed anything. Like she knew something." Dana scribbled down the name. "Can you get her on the phone?" "I'll try," Jada said, grabbing her phone. It took 2 calls before Lucia answered. Her voice trembled when she realized who it was. Mrs. Smith? Lucia, Jada said gently. I need your help. The silence that followed stretched long enough to make Jada wonder if the line had dropped. But then Lucia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew this would happen, she said. What do you mean? They do this all the time, Lucia said. Not just to guests, to staff, too. If you don't fit their idea of what this place should be, they make you feel like you don't belong, like you're less than. Jada exchanged a glance with Will. Will you talk to someone? She asked. Off the record at first, just to get your story out. Another pause. Then, yes. Jada let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Dana didn't waste time. Within hours, she had a draft of the story ready to pitch, along with clips from Will's video and Lucia's recorded statement. By the following morning, the first wave of headlines hit, Hollywood power couple calls out discrimination at elite gala, and inside the hidden racism of high society. The backlash was swift. The event's organizers issued a carefully worded statement, denying wrongdoing and accusing Will and Jada of exaggerating events to create controversy. Meanwhile, anonymous employees came forward to back Lucia's claims, and a leaked email revealed explicit instructions to prioritize white guests and downplay complaints from others. The battle lines were drawn. Jada and Will weren't just fighting for their own dignity anymore. They were fighting to expose a system designed to keep people like them out. As Jada sat at the kitchen table scrolling through comments online, some supportive, others hateful, she felt the weight of the fight ahead, but she also felt something else. Resolve. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning sun streamed through the sheer curtains of their living room, but its warmth did nothing to ease the chill in Jada's chest. She sat on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees, scrolling through endless streams of comments, news articles, and headlines. The video had gone viral overnight. Clips of Will standing tall in the ballroom calling out the hypocrisy of the so-called elite were replayed on every major network. Social media was ablaze with reactions, and hashtags like #SmithsSpeakTruth and #Elitist Racism Exposed were trending. But with the support came the inevitable flood of vitriol. Attention seekers. Playing the race card. Maybe if they acted like they belonged, they wouldn't have been treated that way. Jada's fingers tightened around the edge of her laptop. It wasn't the criticism itself that got to her. It was how predictable it all felt. She had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. Across the room, Will paced, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with their lawyer. His shoulders were rigid, his free hand gesturing sharply as he emphasized each point. Yes, I understand, he said, pausing to listen, but we're not backing down. Jada closed her laptop and leaned back, letting her head rest against the cushion. The exhaustion of the past 24 hours was starting to catch up with her, but she knew there wouldn't be time to rest. Not yet. Will ended the call and dropped onto the couch beside her. That was David, he said, referring to their attorney. The resort's legal team is threatening to sue for defamation. Jada sat up. What? They're claiming the video paints them in a false light and damages their reputation. They want us to retract the footage and issue an apology. Jada let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Apologize? For what? Telling the truth? They're scared, Will said, and they should be. Jada's phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from Dana. Call me, now. She hit dial immediately, and Dana picked up after the first ring. "We've got another source," Dana said without preamble. "Two, actually. Both former employees. One of them worked in management." Jada's heart raced. "And?" "They confirmed everything Lucia told us, and more. The seating arrangements, intentional. The extra security checks, policy. And get this, they have emails. Internal communications instructing staff to handle certain guests with extra scrutiny to preserve the resort's atmosphere." Jada's stomach turned. "You have copies?" "They're sending them now." Jada hung up and turned to Uil. "We have them," she said. "Proof." For the first time that morning, she saw Uil's shoulders relax, if only slightly. By noon, the story had escalated. Dana published her follow-up piece, complete with quotes from the new whistleblowers and screenshots of the leaked emails. One email stood out, a directive from the resort's general manager instructing staff to ensure high-profile guests whose appearance may not align with the image we cultivate were seated in less visible areas. Another email explicitly described a protocol for handling guests who might attract unwanted attention, citing Uil and Jada by name. The backlash was immediate. News anchors dissected the story in real time, and opinion columns debated whether the resort's practices reflected broader patterns of systemic racism within elite spaces. Celebrities weighed in, some voicing support for the Smiths, while others urged caution, warning against rushing to judgment. And then there were the threats. Anonymous messages began pouring in, emails, voicemails, social media comments. Some accused Jada and Will of trying to destroy good people for personal gain. Others were more explicit, filled with racial slurs and thinly veiled threats of violence. Jada read one aloud, her voice steady despite the chill that ran down her spine. "You should have stayed in your lane. Now you'll pay for stepping out of it." Will snatched the phone from her hand and deleted the message. "We're getting security," he said. "We're not hiding," Jada shot back. "No," he said, "but we're not taking chances either." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, their home became a war room. Dana arrived with stacks of notes, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into her features. Their lawyer joined them, going over strategies to counter the defamation threats while ensuring the whistleblowers were protected. But it was Lucia who arrived last, her expression nervous but resolute. "I can't stay long," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jada took her hand. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." Lucia sat at the dining table, her hands clasped tightly as she recounted story after story. Staff fired for speaking out, guests humiliated and dismissed, and a culture of silence reinforced by fear of losing jobs or visas. By the time she finished, Jada felt sick. "They'll come after me," Lucia said quietly. "No, they won't," Will replied. "Not if we shine a light so bright they can't hide in the shadows anymore." The following morning, Dana's latest story hit the front page. Culture of exclusion. Former employees expose racism behind resort's glamorous facade. The resort's legal team fired back, calling the allegations baseless and accusing Dana of exploiting disgruntled ex-employees. But the damage was already done. Sponsors pulled out of future events. High-profile guests distanced themselves. And yet, as Jada scrolled through the headlines, she knew the fight wasn't over. The comments were still there. The trolls, the apologists, the people who refused to see what was right in front of them. But there were also others. People who shared their own stories of discrimination. People who thanked her for speaking out. People who said, "I see you." Jada looked at Will and saw the same fire burning in his eyes that had carried them through the night of the gala. "This isn't over," she said softly. Will nodded. No, he agreed. It's just getting started. The rain began to fall in steady, deliberate drops as Jada stood at the window, watching rivulets of water slide down the glass. The gray sky mirrored the weight in her chest, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a lingering sense of unfinished business. It had been 3 days since the resort issued its official statement, a hollow apology wrapped in corporate jargon. Words like deep regret and commitment to diversity were scattered throughout, but there was no admission of guilt. No accountability. Instead, they blamed isolated incidents and misunderstandings, promising to launch internal investigations and implement diversity training. Jada scoffed as she read the email aloud to Uil. Diversity training? She had said, like that's going to fix what's broken in places like that. But the public wasn't buying it. Dana's latest piece had unearthed even more damning evidence: pay disparities among employees of color, discriminatory hiring practices, and reports of verbal abuse from management. Social media erupted with demands for accountability. Sponsors dropped their partnerships. Major news outlets ran op-eds questioning the culture of exclusivity in elite spaces. Jada turned away from the window, her eyes landing on the stack of letters and emails piling up on the kitchen counter. Messages of support poured in from strangers across the country. Young women who thanked her for showing strength, parents who shared their fears for their children, and workers who had endured similar treatment but never had the platform to speak out. But there were also the threats. We know where you live. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it. Stay silent, or we'll make you. Uil had insisted on hiring private security, but Jada hated the way it made their home feel like a fortress. Cameras on every corner, motion sensors on every door. It was a reminder that their fight came with risks. And yet, as she looked at Uil now, sitting at the dining table surrounded by legal documents and media briefs, she knew they couldn't back down. Uil glanced up and met her gaze. You okay? Jada nodded, even though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. You? He exhaled. Ask me when this is over. She crossed the room and sat beside him, placing a hand on his arm. It's never really over, is it? No, he admitted, but we keep fighting anyway. The next day brought another wave of headlines. CEO steps down amid resort scandal. Former staff speak out about culture of discrimination. Smiths demand structural change, not apologies. The resignation of the CEO was the most public consequence yet. A symbolic victory, but one that felt hollow without deeper reforms. Jada and Uil doubled down, calling for independent investigations into the resort's practices and pushing for broader changes in the hospitality industry. They partnered with advocacy groups and launched a campaign promoting workplace equality. Donations poured in. Celebrities added their voices. But the resistance was just as fierce. Business leaders accused them of tarnishing reputations and ruining livelihoods. Commentators framed them as privileged celebrities who were out of touch with real struggles. And the lawsuit for defamation still loomed, though their legal team was confident it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. Dana remained by their side, reporting every twist and turn, while Lucia became a quiet hero in the story, a symbol of the countless workers silenced by fear and circumstance. When Lucia's story aired on national television, Jada sat beside her in the studio, holding her hand as she spoke about years of mistreatment, about the fear of losing her job, and about finally finding the courage to speak out. I didn't think anyone would listen, Lucia said, her voice trembling, but I saw them stand up and I thought, maybe it's time I stood up too. The interview went viral, but Lucia's bravery came at a cost. She lost her job despite the resort's claims that no one would face retaliation. "That's it," Jada said when she heard the news. "They don't get to bury this." The press conference was held a week later. Ul and Jada stood together at the podium, the room packed with journalists and cameras. Behind them, Lucia and other former employees sat in rows, their presence a silent but powerful testament to the truth. "This isn't just about one night," Ul began. "This is about a culture, a system that tells people they don't belong, that their presence is tolerated but never welcomed." Jada stepped forward. "We're not here for apologies. We're here for change. Real change, and we won't stop until we see it." Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and for the first time since the night of the gala, Jada felt like they were being heard, not as celebrities, but as people demanding justice. Later that night, Jada and Ul sat on their back porch, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "You know this isn't the end," Jada said softly. Ul nodded. "I know." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. "What if it's not enough?" Jada asked finally. "It won't be," Ul admitted. "Not on its own, but it's a start." Jada leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We'll keep pushing. Always." The rain started again, soft and steady, tapping against the roof and pooling in the grass. It felt cleansing, as though the storm had passed, even if the skies were still gray. And as Jada closed her eyes, she knew one thing for certain. They had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. Change wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy, but it had to start somewhere. And this fight, this moment, was just the beginning. Thank you for watching this video. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Watch other videos on our channel for more thought-provoking stories. Share this video with your friends and family to discuss important topics and change the world for the better. Thank you for being with us.